Hi, I'm Marta Puxan-Oliva. I'm a senior researcher at the Universitat de les Illes Balears, and I'm going to present a paper today that is entitled Negotiating Environmental Criminality, Spectacular Crime versus Slow Crime in Contemporary Fiction. So the globally sensed environmental crisis and efforts to redress it today have interrogated our conventional definition of crime to the highest level, legally, politically, and culturally. The fact that strong campaigns like Stop Ecocide and the International Parliamentary Alliance for the Recognition of Ecocide are arguing that ecocide itself should be established as an international crime showcases that the daily inflicted environmental harm and the overlap of bodies and institutions in charge of regulating it in a coordinated range of scales have definitely produced a deep questioning of the concept of crime itself. In the past few years, even a new field of criminology has emerged, green criminology, which directly targets this problem and proposes a revision of environmental crime. The boundaries of what counts and what does not count as environmental crime are blurred. Just to pick one example, one would certainly point to illegal fishing as a major environmental crime, but will hesitate to define massive bottom trawling as a crime, even though it is scientifically documented that it irreversibly devastates the seabed and its ecosystems. Since many trawling practices are permitted, this widely used fishing technique might simply not qualify as a criminal practice. And yet, if we disregard its obvious economic profit, it is not hard to imagine that this fishing technique is prohibited in the near future. The examples are endless, including gas emissions, techniques such as fracking or mountaintop removal mining, high sound level emissions in submarine surveillance, and toxic and plastic dumping. In light of crime in fiction, in a broader sense, how does the current discussion over redefining crime prompt us to revise this notion in fiction? Furthermore, how does literature participate in this changing idea of crime today? This paper argues that contemporary fiction is strongly contributing to reveal the ambivalences and maladjustments that lay at the basis of our working interpretations of crime. Fiction undertakes this task through its recent interest in environmental crime and its formal elaboration by means of embedded narratives that question the weak boundaries that today separate some spectacular bloody crimes from other less visible ones that operate at other scales and other temporalities, not necessarily human. In this, environmental crime is a cornerstone. I will review the discussion over the distinctions between environmental harm and crime proposed by green criminologists, will consider how fiction expresses this definition problem, and will sketch how criminality has permeated a number of narratives that have environmental crime at their core, through the examples of Roberto Ampuero's El Alemán de Atacama, the German of Atacama, and Wajdi Mouawad's Anima. So my first section is entitled Environmental Criminality in the Spotlight, Redefining Crime. What we legally define as crime is a social and cultural convention that changes through different political and legal systems over time. While this is probably widely accepted, attachment to and concern for already legally established crimes often shortcuts discussion over what we consider crime. However, when new sensibilities and contexts emerge, the blurring contours of legally established crimes are shaken, as it has occurred with regards to environmental crime. Environmental harms are hard to assess because they often have long-term consequences, are accumulative, hardly visible, and tend to inflict ecosystemic harm rather than direct harm to human beings. Oftentimes, environmental harm is difficult to detect, trace, and prosecute. All these features condition their ill fit in a legal system that is mostly based on harm inflicted to humans, readily identifiable and traceable. In this, environmental harm is a hidden emergency because it is most probably potentially criminal, but its slow violence and its invisibility makes it less readily established as crime than spectacular crime. In addition, harm that qualifies as environmental crime is regulated through different legal bodies, such as administrative law versus criminal law, as De La Cuesta attests, at local, national, and international scales that need to agree in various points to find a difficult, fragile collective agreement due to the perception that environmental crime is a global concern that needs to be agreed upon in international treaties in order to palliate the effects of what is a global environmental crisis. These layers truly make the definition of environmental crime an extremely complex matter. Thus, the peculiarities of environmental crime and harm demand a new reflection and revision with regard to how environmental criminality is being assessed today. A new field has emerged from this preoccupation: green criminology. As Avi Brisman and Nigel Soud define it, and I quote at length, green criminology refers to the study of environmental crimes and harms affecting human and non-human life, ecosystems, and the biosphere. More specifically, green criminology explores and analyzes the causes, consequences, and prevalence of environmental crime and harm, the responses to and prevention of environmental crime and harm by the legal system, civil, criminal, regulatory, and by non-governmental entities and social movements, as well as the meaning and mediated representations of environmental crime and harm. End quote. A substantial body of this scholarship revises our idea of crime with a broader view, since, as Potter points out, and I quote, when we strip away the value positions to the bare science that underpins green criminology, we are left with an important observation. A green perspective can contribute greatly to our general understanding of crime. End quote. Key to this revision is an expansion of the concept of crime beyond legal boundaries that focuses on inflicted harm and on the consequences that practices have rather than the actions themselves and their agents. As Morelle Ungria explains, and I quote, environmental harm is considered a crime within the standpoint of critical criminology, both as cause of the crime and as factor to take into account in the prevention of risk situations. In this, eco-criminology can be a uniting point between crime and environmental harm. End quote. Focusing on harm, to weigh what should be considered criminal practices involves the central concern for the consequences to the environment and to human beings, and helps us identify the extent to which some practices can have an impact on the environment and humankind in the long run, and facilitates a critical legislation attentive to prevention. Rob White explains it along similar lines, and here I also quote at length. If ecological and social and economic welfare, says Rob White, is to be maximized, then there is a need to explain notions of what actually constitutes environmental crime. Harm, as conceived by critical green criminologists, for example, demands more encompassing definitions than that offered by mainstream law and traditional criminology. This is because some of the most ecologically destructive activities, such as clear felling of all grown forest, is quite legal, while more benign practices such as growing of hemp and extremely strong fiber is criminalized. Green criminology, says White, provides an umbrella under which to theorize and critique both illegal environmental harm, that is, environmental harms currently defined as unlawful and therefore punishable, and legal environmental harms, that is, environmental harms currently condoned as lawful, but which are nevertheless socially and ecologically harmful. How harm is conceptualized is thus partly shaped by how the legal-illegal divide is construed within specific research and analysis. End quote. So the simultaneous focus on harm to both the environment and human beings also favors adopting an ecocentric perspective, which takes sustainability as measure for environmental criminality. These challenging perspectives to criminology and to criminal and administrative law push forward the sharp boundaries of crime, adopt an ecosystemic perspective, and invite understanding of the deep interconnections within the ecosystem that make sustainability a clear future priority. It also forces us to address the fact that, as Wajdi reminds us, and I quote, "What constitutes environmental crime is therefore contentious and ambiguous," end quote. A contested and ambiguous conceptualization that we need to assume as constituent of environmental criminality, and which possibilities and shortcomings we need to revise. So I'll move to my second section, which is called Environmental Crime and Harm in Contemporary Fiction. An emerging corpus of contemporary fiction in various genres, from realist novels to crime fictions to science fiction, addresses environmental harm as potential criminality. Novels as different as Juan Villoro's Arrecife, Luis Sepúlveda's Mundo del Fin del Mundo, John Grishman's Grey Mountain, Michael Crichton's State of Fear, Frank Chatzing's The Swarm, Ming Yu's The Man with the Compound Eyes, or John Lanchester's The Wall use diverse narrative strategies to highlight this ambiguity. Several of these novels signal criminality through creating double stories that establish both a criminal framework in the classic clear and spectacular crime, often a character's murder, which is being traced as the plot unfolds, and the environmental damage scenario, like a harmful environmental scenario, whose inflicted harm resonates with the target crime. Through this narrative strategy, the genre's central feature of a crime prepares the reader to apprehend an environmental criminality that goes beyond the specific murder, which mostly ties together the main crime with the consequences of indirect environmental victims. In many occasions, the environmental harm is related to economic business, the profit of which derives from activities that transform the environments and affect ecosystems as a whole. Let me provide two brief examples to show how these novels operate along these lines. The first one is a novel published in 1996, the Chilean crime fiction novel El Alemán de Atacama, The German of Atacama, by Roberto Ampuero, which features the murder of a German activist, Wilbalsen, that proposes a new irrigation plan that could hold an Atacama Desert indigenous community, as well as a growing ecotourism site around it. As the detective Cayetano Brulé discovers, the murder was committed by an oil and mineral extraction German company that illegally buried toxic waste from European chemical experiments into the desert in agreement with a Chilean deputy. Having discovered the real business of the German company, Balsen is murdered in a clear crime, traceable and prosecutable. However, the novel leaves the interventionist hydric plans and the chemical waste disposal which endanger the living supplies of the Atacama community unsolved. In presenting a clear identifiable crime as the basis of the plot development within the framework of crime fiction, El Alemán de Atacama unfolds a subjacent environmental criminality that remains pending legal definition and resolution. Thereby, the novel supplies a criminal atmosphere to interrogate environmental harm as criminal, and to project the paradox of the structural prosecution of individual well-established crimes and the entangled irresolution of slow environmental crimes such as global toxic waste disposal. My second example. In the 2012 novel Anima, by the Canadian-Lebanese Wajdi Mouawad, interrogation of environmental harm is directly driven by the historical removal of Native Americans from their own territories and their inclusion in reservations, which has led to drug and weapons traffic in a disastrous transformation of their way of life, forced by an integration process that broke the ecosystemic living of the communities. The plot is driven by the highly spectacular rape and murder of the main character's wife, which is under-investigated by the US and Canadian police because the murderer is a Mouawad who participates of the armed and band defending the reservation while simultaneously acting as police informant. The chief coach explains to the main character, and I quote, "Every reserve has a band council. The council is the Mohawks' official voice in political affairs. But every reserve also has an arm branch that takes care of the less official things and for whom the Canadian and American border doesn't mean much. For us, there are only lakes, rivers, hunting and fishing territories, sacred mountains, and tribes. The Mohawks' reserves have pacts of alliance and cooperation between them, regardless of the borders determined by the white men. Arms, money, cigarettes, and alcohol move from one side to the other. This trafficking allows us to survive and to defend ourselves, but it has also become the reason for a war between us. It is a mafia that poisons our lives and is decimating many of our ranks. We have to fight an enemy outside and an enemy within." End quote. Written from a highly polyphonic perspective of multiple animal narrators who observe bits of the story and overhear conversations, the novel adopts a strong ecosystem perspective that decenters the criminal story and explores the relations between human beings and animals, a relationship that is emphasized by its comparison with a reservation. As Coach states, and I quote, "An Indian reserve is like a wounded animal. It survives and it's always at war. It fears death, but it doesn't die. It's vulnerable and it's dangerous." End quote. The use of multiple animal narrators lays bare the spectacle of the crime, creating an atmosphere that strongly contrasts to the silent Indian removal and breaking of the sustainable arrangement between Native American communities and the environment, but impregnates the removal with the suggestion that it is criminal from an environmental and human rights perspective. Through this strategy, the spectacular crime indexes environmental harm as criminal in a blurred correlation that showcases the ambiguity of the fundamental distinctions between harm and crime. In conclusion, as we see, a growing corpus of contemporary novels in several traditions and from diverse genres interested in the environmental crisis has enhanced the revision of environmental criminality in its very definition, and it has explored its ambivalent location in our current imagination and legislation of crime. In addressing environmental harm in conjunction with criminal elements, novels such as the aforementioned contribute to push forward the legal delimitations of environmental crime so as to invite reflection on the subjacent status of environmental damage and the visible consequences it has on sustainability and human beings. Contributing to literary discussions on crime and the environment, contemporary fiction is developing interesting plot, time, and space narrative strategies that effectively link environmental harm to crime, such as double plotting, I had just illustrated, thereby extending our conception of crime to potential less visible and less resolved criminality. The polemical invitation of green criminologists to revise environmental harm and crime demands a serious consideration, which should at least generate public awareness that environmental crime cannot be satisfactorily resolved as legally established today, and that a great ambiguity lays as it in its heart and its current legal form. A challenging task that contemporary fiction has decidedly undertaken and that certainly deserves further exploration. Thank you.